in the mission, the Nicaragua mission, to the Organization of American States. Indeed, on behalf of all of us who work here, on behalf of Nicaragua in this country, I want to welcome each and every one of you here today at our embassy. We are especially pleased to be participating in this, the last day of Black History Month here in the United States. The month of February, is also of great importance to the Nicaraguan people, because it was in the month of February that, did I say May or? I said February. Because it was in the month of February that the hero of the Nicaragua Revolution, national hero of the country, suffered martyrdom. When he was killed, they thought that the goals and the ideals that he defended would go to the tomb and forever be forgotten. But they were wrong. The ideals of Sandino sprang back into life with the revolution of 1979 that bears his name. It was led by the Sandinista National Liberation Front. And that movement was inspired in the struggle, and the successful struggle, I might add, of Sandino, because before his martyrdom, he succeeded in driving the United States Marines, who had been occupying our country for many years, bringing great pain and suffering to the Nicaraguan people. That is why I'm so happy that we are able to bring together these two very important events. You're celebrating here Black History Month, and we commemorating the memory of General Sandino. I remember in 1983, right here in this hall, we had a gathering of some of the most emblematic leaders of the civil rights movement here in Washington, here in the United States. We had Coretta Scott King, we had Andrew Young, we had Jesse Jackson, we had Jack Odell. Indeed, we had some of the most outstanding members of the civil rights movement leadership. Joseph Lowry, CLC, he was also here. And we were here because the Frente Sandinista wanted to show its solidarity with the civil rights movement of the United States. They were here in Washington to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Nicaragua wanted to be present and indeed sent a high-level delegation to accompany the American civil rights movement in that very important occasion. And that was not surprising, because one of the key components of Sandino's vision was international solidarity. He was convinced that struggling people all around the world should identify with each other, should support each other. He became radicalized after he was working in the oil fields in Mexico after the revolution in that country. And Sandino felt so proud of what the Mexicans were accomplishing that he felt motivated to return to Nicaragua, to take on the struggle to expel the American Marines who were occupying the country. And as a result, he had this strong sense. He assigned great value to solidarity and cooperation among peoples struggling for justice and dignity throughout the world. This is a note from Gandhi to Sandino. It says, in my prison I received the word about your message to the American people and the documents that you sent in which you are exchanging your best wishes for us to be able to cooperate together. That's Gandhi in 1928, writing to Sandino, recognizing the importance of international cooperation and solidarity in the struggle for justice and dignity of all peoples. And this is another message, expression of the importance of solidarity from Pablo Neruda to Sandino, and he refers to him as my friend. And then he goes on expressing his strong support, strong solidarity for the struggle in Nicaragua for human dignity and justice. So it is for us natural that we would want to welcome you here today. We welcome you here as friends, as brothers, as compañeros in the long struggle for justice, the long struggle for human dignity. We are convinced that working together, we can indeed create a better world for our children and our children's children. That is the challenge that we have before us. And we are very proud and happy to be among people who share that ideal and who have committed themselves to that struggle. I see here Lucy Murphy. I've been working with her going back to 1982. And she's always the same, always willing and completely and totally dedicated to the cause. So, thank you. Thank you very much for being here and welcome to the Nicaraguan Embassy. Think of it as your home.
I'd like to thank the ambassador for those warm words, especially speaking about international solidarity, and we are expressing that. And it's with that in mind that we came up with this program this evening. Next, we'll hear from our sister Deborah Johnson, who will do a presentation on Claudia Jones. The floor is yours.
I'm a comedian, but I'm a little nervous. So bear with me. Okay. Claudia Jones, breaking the silence. To live is to suffer. To suffer is to find truth. Through truth, my suffering, I started to seek all truths. I found my true voice when I found Claudia Vera Jones. Originally known as Claudia Cumberbatch, she was a descendant of the slaves once owned by the Cumberbatch family, born in Port of Spain, Trinidad, for her family migrated to the United States in 1924 and became Harlem residents. Her parents dreamed of rearing their children in a free America, but that dream soon faded with the truth of indifference. Their family was poor and lived in substandard living conditions. 5 years after their arrival, Claudia's mother, a garment worker who worked long days in harsh conditions at a garment shop, died from spinal meningitis. And she herself would later contract tuberculosis in 1932 at age 17. Though a gifted student, her illness would cut her schooling short, but it didn't deter her, although it would haunt her for the rest of her days. She would learn as an unnaturalized immigrant woman, opportunities were virtually non-existent for a Black woman. The chain of events of her life had her wondering, why was there a contradiction in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which contained its precepts of the pursuit for all and the right to have liberty and justice? Claudia would later credit her radical views. Claudia would later credit her radical political views as the beginning of the death of her mother at just age 37, having worked as a machine worker in harsh conditions in a garment factory. Her death led Claudia to develop an understanding of the suffering of her people, recognizing that the degradation of Black communities in America was shared to a degree by the non-Black working classes. Although her formal education came to an end because of her illness, her actual education had just begun. She found a political education in social activism. She spent a lot of time listening to street corner meetings of the various political parties and movements in Harlem. In 1931, 9 young Black teenagers, known as the Scottsboro Boys, ages 13 to 20, were falsely accused of the rape of 2 white women in Alabama and sentenced to death after an unfair trial. Their case was appealed with the help of the Community Party USA, and in 1936, in a search for organizations that were supporting the boys fighting systematic racism, Claudia, only age 18, joined the Young Communist League USA. A year later, she joined the editorial staff as a Communist Party's daily worker, rising to be the editor of the Weekly Review in 1938, where she wrote on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys Legal Defense and the editor of the Young Communist League, USA's monthly journal during World War II. Claudia was a proud communist her entire adult life and a leader in several major movements that marked the 20th century. These included the African American Liberation Movement in the U.S., the International Communist Movement and the struggle for the rights of women, the battle for world peace, and the Caribbean fight for independence and unity. During her 30 years in the States, Claudia was vocal in her belief that peace could be attained if women, especially poor women, were excluded from the conversation. Claudia consistently stood against the exploitation and oppression, and her advocacy of socialism and world peace did not go unnoticed by the U.S. government during the McCarthy era. She was arrested in 1948, being incarcerated for 6 months. She was arrested again in 1955 and subsequently sent to federal prison. Since she never gained U.S. citizenship, Claudia was deported from the United States to England, where she immediately became involved in the various struggles to the West Indian community and other national oppressed groups. She arrived to a country in flux with widespread post-war immigration and racial tension and strife. Claudia soon made it her mission to protect and campaign on behalf of the Caribbean community. She was a woman like no other. She was a feminist, Black nationalist, Black rights campaigner, community leader, communist, journalist, gifted orator, and the mother of the Notting Hill Carnival. The diversity of her political affiliations clearly illustrated her multifaceted approach to the struggle for equal rights in the 20th century. That said, her spirit lives on in us. For now is the time to cultivate the unity of oneness with others who seek a brighter future as Claudia did. The lines of otherness are erased when we see we are all magnificent when unified. I am Claudia Jones. Thank you.
And so she claimed she was nervous. You could have fooled me, but I think it's with that backdrop of what Sister Deborah just mentioned, the reason that we want to inaugurate the Claudia Jones School of Political Education is because of the type of leader that she was, exemplary. She put the communist leadership during that period under heavy manners, as an expression is used in the Caribbean, put them in check. Because at that time, some communist leaders felt that the question of women's struggle or feminism was something that should be led only by women, that it wasn't a national policy to be concerned about. You know, to give the importance of what it is today in terms of gender liberation or radical feminist politics, as expressed by Angela Davis and many people that feel the same way as she does. So we want to emulate Claudia Jones, what she represented, the very best of the Communist Party, her leadership within the Black Liberation Movement. And what we want to be able to do today in this era, for this epoch, is that we want to create the epistemologies that are necessary, meaning those understandings that are necessary so that we can deal with some of the complicated issues that we're dealing with today. She was the very first person to speak about the triple oppression of women, as Black women, as a worker, and as women. Angela Davis gives credit to her and mentions her in her works. And now we use the term of intersectionality coined by, if I'm not mistaken, Kimberly Crenshaw. So there are new challenges with regards to the question of sexual relations or sexuality is an undertaking that we have to become comfortable with these struggles, be familiar with these struggles, understand what being gay or being homosexual, what lesbianism is all about. We have to understand we cannot be afraid of these issues and undertaking. How are we going to develop and grow as a party of the masses that's really representative of the multiracial, multinational community that we all live in? If we don't understand these issues, we can't be afraid any longer. We have to take risks. We're elders. I've been in the movement now for more than 50 years. But I have to listen to my younger brothers and sisters who are leading the path in the struggles today. Yes, I can serve unto a certain degree and be able to share with them some wisdom that I might have gained over the years. But it has to be an exchange, an intergenerational exchange, learning from each other. We have to develop that kind of pedagogy, and exchanging ideas, sharing it, and acknowledging when we are wrong, when we make. We have a lot of baggage that we carry today. We have a lot of baggage. When we talk about social relations, when we talk about racism, there's black folks and brown folks who have been exposed and socialized to those ideas, who sometimes, unbeknownst to them sometimes, promote or capitulate to racism. You have people, when it comes to the question of punishment, who support prisons, who support creating these supermax prisons. We got to get away from that normative thinking that is justifiable. The biggest struggle is the battle of ideas. And the hardest one is, how do we speak to the masses? How do we approach them? We can no longer be afraid of that. You know, we talk about the trade union movement, and I'm quite sure Bill Fletcher will shed some light on that. You know, at the same time the trade union movement was going on, parallel existing to it was Jim Crow. And the same practice of Jim Crow was practiced within the labor movement, with these closed shops. And you could not get into the construction trades unless you was Italian or Irish. And that's the way it was. It was closed as a way of controlling the trade union movement and the labor aristocracy that existed. And we talk about the demise of the trade union movement. This is part of the problem. This is part of the problem. You know, people have problems with accepting the leadership of African Americans, of brown people, of women, of gay folks. Come on now, when we talk about freedom and democracy, we got to expand the meaning of that. We got to extend that. So I don't want to say any more to belabor the point, because we brought a speaker here that I think will shed some light on some other things that we would like to listen to, and time is of the essence. And so I'm going to have Mr. Carl Gentile come over to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends and comrades. Good afternoon. I've had the pleasure and opportunity to work with Bill Fletcher when we both were on the staff of the American Federation of Government Employees. And one of the things that I've learned from him is that unions should be a movement and not an institution. And sadly, it has become that for the very reasons that Comrade Jaime mentioned. And we both struggled in that union to make it a better place. We didn't really have a chance to make it succeed. Hopefully we planted some ideas to make it go forward. But without further ado, I want to introduce my friend and former colleague, Bill Fletcher.
Thank you, Carl. Good afternoon. I want to thank the Claudia Jones School and the Nicaraguan Embassy. In listening to the ambassador, I was thinking about 1979 and the historic significance of that year with the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Grenadian Revolution, the initial stages of the Iranian Revolution, which unfortunately went a different path. And most importantly, in 1979, I married my soulmate, which was of great historical significance. I was asked to talk about African-American radicalism and the unions, but I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start with Black History Month. And I want to dedicate my remarks to Katherine Johnson and James Garrett. Now, one of the things about Black History Month, which is truly unfortunate, is that to a great extent it's taught along the lines of famous Negroes I've known. And so what has happened, whether in school or in many popular movements, we get a list of people that made certain accomplishments, and that's great to know. But there is a way that that is handled where we have a lack of context. We have an elevation of the elite. So we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have ministers, etc. Only a couple of Black women, Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks. And very rarely is the Black worker of any significance in Black History Month. And I think it's really important for us to engage in sort of a revolution in rethinking Black History Month. So first of all, our principal objective must be to change the month. You've got to get away from February. This whole thing in February is a real problem, right? It's got to be like June. You know, it's a longer month when it's better weather and you don't have to worry about cancellation of events. So our principal objective, right? But the second thing is to rethink the way we consider Black History Month. You know, I'm sure many of you saw Hidden Figures and the story of Katherine Johnson and other women who were known as computers and the role that they played. And what's interesting in that is not just the figure of Katherine Johnson and not just that it was women, but that these were scientists. And one of the problems when African American history is addressed is very rarely do our contributions in science and technology get fully acknowledged. You know, what's really interesting, and I mean this quite seriously, when you look at what African Americans have invented, the question that emerges is, what did non-Jewish whites invent? Because the list of contributions by African American inventors is absolutely amazing. Every time I'm on a subway or a train, I think about the coupling, right? Because once upon a time, coupling was not done automatically, and workers died regularly when they were crushed, when the cars were being put together, and they had to be there to couple the trains. And the development of that technology was an African American. The electric fan was an African American. The dustpan was an African American. You go on, and it's like, really, I mean, I seriously say, what did non-Jewish whites invent? Right? Because of these contributions, which are systematically ignored. And when we have Black History Month, we hear about very important figures, but rarely do you get this sense of the diversity of brilliance that we have. And so I wanted to say that to start. But then there's the issue of the Black worker. When my wife and I lived in Boston, every January there was the Boston Rainbow Coalition would have a King celebration. Mine was a King celebration. And people would receive various honors. And, in the lead up to that, many of us that were members were asked, well, who should be honored? And every year, beginning in 1982, I submitted one name. It was a guy named James Garrett. And James Garrett never received an award. The people that received awards, even from this progressive group, tended to be state representative this, state senator that, Reverend such and such, Dr. such and such, but nothing to James Garrett. So who was this guy? So James Garrett was a welder. And he went to work in the Quincy shipyard, and he went to work then in the Ironworkers Union. And the Ironworkers had never had a black member from when they were formed, the local in Boston. And so he was refused entrances into the union as a member, and he brought a lawsuit. It became a class action, and he won. Now, in carrying out the class action, he faced all kinds of harassment, death threats, etc. He was a hero, but no one acknowledged, few people acknowledged his contributions. And few people acknowledged that he was part of actually a movement, that he was great, he was courageous, but he was leading a movement of black workers to indeed transform not just one local, but to transform the construction industry. And so when we're thinking about Black History Month, we've got to think broader. And we've got to introduce class and gender. And we've got to diversify our understanding about the brilliance of black people. So I wanted to start there. Now, the second piece is about the main theme. And this was, I don't know whether Carl and Arturo, in inviting you to speak, understood that we are going to be going until breakfast tomorrow to address this subject. So I hope people brought sleeping bags and everything else. You ask someone to talk about African-American radicalism and the trade union movement, it's like, oh, that's all? I mean, really? Why didn't you make it a little simpler? More whatever. But I want to take elements of this because I'd like to get into some discussion. In order to talk about this, we need to start with this issue of African American radicalism and black radicalism. And what do we mean by that? So, what we mean by I'm going to start with black radicalism is to think about it as the streams of water coming down from a hill that collect in a lake. And that lake is black radicalism. And the different streams, there are different currents of thought, Marxism, nationalism, various forms of feminism, etc. They're coming down that hill. And when they're coming down the hill, they're very distinct. And then when they reach each other, and form that lake, you can't distinguish the stream that the water came from. It becomes the lake. Black radicalism is that lake. And it's made up of those different currents of thinking, of action that have existed in Black America since the moment that we were first brought here as indentured servants and slaves. And so that radicalism has been an attempt to fight for absolute emancipation and actually to fight for something that Lenin called consistent democracy. And black radicalism is that. It's that. It is not one current. It's not one ideological tendency. It is the accumulation of those. And I say black radicalism because, it's interesting. African Americans are an ethnic group. That's true. We're the result of a number of things. Black is the uncolor of the racially oppressed. And it's important that sometimes, particularly post-1980, when we've gotten into a kind of ethno-nationalist way of looking at things, we forget at how broadly Black has been used as an identity of the oppressed. It was first used as an identity imposed on us by the oppressors. The European colonialists would describe the racially subordinate as Black, whether they were from Africa or whether they're from South Asia, whether they're from the Philippines or whether they were in Latin America, they would be identified as Black. Those that were racially oppressed then began to take the term and twist it into an instrument to identify what one could call the real Black International, not the Black International of the anarchists, but the international of those fighting racism and colonialism. And thus you have people who are South Asian, who when you ask them, what are you, they will say, I am Black. If you look in South Africa and the Black consciousness movement that emerged, it was not just people that were of African indigenous ancestry. You had people that were of South Asian and other ancestry who would say, no, we are Black. And they will fight you if you suggest anything else. So it's important for us to understand Black radicalism as an international current. And it's not just about African Americans. Now, none of this is to diminish the importance of understanding this notion of African Americans. And this is a little bit of a tangent time, so I'm going to ask forgiveness in advance. But there's this tendency that's emerged, very dangerous one, that is saying that the only African Americans are those that can prove that their ancestors were enslaved in North America. Now, I'm not going to mention the name of this particular formation, but some of you may know, and if you whistle it, I'll tell you the tune. But this is a really dangerous notion. See, for a number of very, very important reasons, African Americans are not simply people that were brought here as indentured servants and slaves, brought to North America, the 13 colonies, and the expanding imperial state. African Americans are the accumulation, and that's one of the things I love about African Americans. I mean, just think about it like this. In the 19th century, a population, the first non-slave African population, came voluntarily to the United States. Who were they? Does anyone know? Cape Verdeans. The first non-slave, right, came here voluntarily. They came here as whalers and fishermen, as the subjects of Portugal. They came here as Roman Catholics. They came here speaking Portuguese or Criollo. They had a different culture, and they found themselves encountering this other African population that was by that point mainly Protestant, mainly spoke English. And over more than 100 years, they fuse. African Americans today would be nothing without the introduction of Cape Verdeans. At the cultural level, anyone ever hear of Horace Silver? The introduction. But then let's go further. In the first decade of the 20th century, there's this major migration. Now, everyone knows it happens, but people don't really think about it as a major migration. What am I talking about? Caribbeans. Introduction of Caribbeans into the United States transforms what it means to be a Black American. Think about people like Malcolm X, Hubert Harrison. I mean, the list goes on and on of the impact of the introduction of Caribbeans. Now, when the Cape Verdeans came here and when the Caribbeans came here, white folks didn't say, oh, you weren't slaves, so you can sit over here and everything is cool, right? As a friend of mine once said about African immigrants, Amadou Diallo was not saved by his immigration status. When these populations entered in, they fused with and changed what it meant to be an African American. And we can't ever forget that. So it's not like you can roll the clock back. You can't say it doesn't matter about the contributions of Caribbeans. It doesn't matter about the Cape Verdeans. There's some sort of, pure African American that only the descendant of a slave. I asked somebody once when they were throwing this at me, I said, well, like, what percentage do you need? I mean, let's just pull out a calculator or something, right? And tell me. I mean, do I qualify? I mean, if I'm mixed I don't identify as mixed, but I am mixed. Does that mean that I'm not like really African American? I mean, is it like 25%? Or maybe it's like 40%? Or what about 15? Right? I mean, at what point does this become nonsense? And so I think we have to understand that what we're talking about as African Americans are the accumulation, the evolution of these different populations. And that's what makes us an amazing population, an amazing people. And we have had a fight. Now, when we were brought over here, it's important in understanding, with regard to the question I was asked about the labor movement and the trade union movement, it's important to understand that the US trade union movement was fundamentally shaped on the basis of the fact that this is a settler state, a racial settler state that had slavery. Thus, in the 1830s, when this movement develops that can be identified as a trade union movement, that is, they take on the name unions and they act like unions, it forms among white people because it forms among people that were free. We could not, as people of African descent at that time, set up unions because most of us were enslaved, and forming anything was an act of insurrection. So in the 1830s, as this movement develops, there's two basic questions that it faces, and they're questions that I would argue the movement has never really fully come to grips with. One is what to do with the fact that it was formed in the context of a settler state. That is, that the Europeans that came here and were turned into white people over a certain period of time, they came here and the state had no interest in the indigenous population. The state was interested in removing the indigenous population, either physically moving them or annihilating them. And the trade union movement is set up in that context, and it doesn't come to grips with what does that mean? What does that mean? You know, is the trade union movement a part of that imperial expansion and annihilation? Or is that trade union movement a movement that opposes that expansion and annihilation? And to a great extent, our movement avoided that, as it did avoid or tried to avoid race. Prior to the end of slavery, there was a great debate about whether or not the trade union movement should even oppose or say anything about slavery, whether slavery was a labor issue. And so the trade union movement, I would argue, has been haunted by these two basic questions. What does it mean to be formed in the context of a settler state, and what does it mean to deal with this issue of race? Which begs this question, what exactly do we mean by race? Because race, you know, I like to say when I give talks that there were no white people on this planet before 1492. And that's not a joke. There were Europeans, but there weren't white people. The construction of white people is associated with both the Reconquista in Spain and what the British did in Ireland in the 1500s, and what the British ultimately do in North America. And part of what's going on, or what was being created at that point, or the importance of the creation of race in North America at least, was this problem that the ruling elite found itself in, which was pure and simple. They had a labor problem. They had laborers from Europe and from Africa, mainly indentured servants, who were constantly revolting. The first labor movements, not trade union movements, labor movements were in the 1600s. And they took the form of bondservant revolts and conspiracies. The elite had to figure out a means in which to address this, because there were more of the workers than there were of the elite. And the construction of race was the most successful means to do that. Just as it worked in Ireland, and ensuring that Ireland remained under British domination for hundreds of years, it worked here in the way that it ensured the domination over what came to be known as the US working class. So that by the 1800s, when we start having a trade union movement that develops, that movement among whites is a movement that sees itself as a white movement. It did not see itself as a movement of a class. It saw itself as a movement of white workers. That, I would argue, is one of the biggest challenges that we had then and continue to have. Now, in response to that, there were constantly efforts by African Americans, by Latinos, by Asians, Native Americans to resist that notion of trade unionism. And I would suggest to you that Black radicalism, when it comes to labor, was not just about trying to fight for inclusion into a labor movement, but it was actually a fight to transform the very nature of trade unionism. Who was organized, how it was taking place, what the objectives were. And so after the Civil War, when African American workers were denied entrance into the first National Labor Federation, called the National Labor Union, they formed the Colored National Labor Union, which was open to everybody, including the Chinese. And in the 1860s, that really meant something, because there was the consistent exclusion of Chinese. This was followed by efforts such as the Knights of Labor, which did significant organizing of Black workers in the South. Unfortunately, they opposed the entrance of Chinese, and that contributed to their demise. The Industrial Workers of the World, the only labor federation in US history that refused to have segregated locals and affiliates, was critically important, and Black workers played a major role there. The unfortunate thing about the Industrial Workers of the World, though, is that they understood race as divisive, but they didn't really understand race. They understood that the employer was playing people against one another, but they didn't understand racial oppression, racist oppression. Certainly didn't understand national oppression. And so they missed out on their major historic tasks. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, in which the Communist Party played a major role, along with other forces on the left, was a site where Black labor activism and Black radicalism became very, very important. And one of those instruments was an organization called the National Negro Congress, which is an organization, it was a united front that gets far less attention historically than it should. It was formed in 1936. The first president was A. Philip Randolph. There were various radicals, including the CP, that was instrumental in building it. And one of the things about them is that they understood that the fight against the Depression and what was happening with the Depression, and the fight to change the way the New Deal was operating, was going to benefit from the rise of this new labor movement. And they played a major role. And they and a number of the left-led unions had significant Black labor leadership. After World War II, and particularly after the advent of the Cold War, there's a major backslide in the US trade union movement when it came to race and inclusion. And as a result, there were various organizations that got formed, and I'm going to speak only about African Americans at this point, that were arguing that the CIO in particular had unfulfilled responsibilities and obligations to the Black worker. The National Negro Labor Council was one example. The Negro American Labor Council was a second. And then the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists in 1973 was a third. But there were also caucuses that developed in various movements. The most well-known, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which tied together Black radicals in Ford, GM, and other places, Chrysler, that were taking on both the employer as well as taking on the role of the union. And there were fights to desegregate the building trades. In New York, there was a major organization called the Harlem Fight Back. And there were other similar organizations, actually the Congress on Racial Equality, before it went off the right end of things under Roy Innis, was very, very active in fighting to desegregate the building trades. and getting black workers in there. And again, the theme is not simply inclusion, but changing the movement. Which leads to my two final points. One is about exclusion and inclusion, and the other is about red baiting. So the history of our trade union movement is one that has had exclusionist forces and inclusionist forces. Those that have outright said, no, we're not going to let blacks in, we're not going to let Chinese in. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The railroad brotherhoods that were formed after the Civil War. Now, what's interesting is that in the South in particular, the major portion of the railroad workforce were black workers. Now, I'm not talking about the porters. I'm talking about the engineers, the oilers, the firemen, etc. They were black. The railroad brotherhoods were formed as white supremacist unions. They had white male-only clauses for membership. They engaged in assassinating, literally, black workers so that they would cleanse the industry. So that was an obvious example of exclusion. We had in the building trades other examples that were less egregious, but no less important in terms of exclusion. And there's been lawsuits and everything. Inclusion, when you think about the CIO unions, most of them organized everybody. But they didn't necessarily organize everybody the same way. So, for example, the United Steelworkers of America would organize plants, and those plants were segregated, and they would organize the plants, they'd get a union there, but they wouldn't necessarily challenge the segregation of the plants. Their theory was that would be divisive, and that a rising tide raises all boats. So that, in other words, the black workers that were in segregated conditions and the Chicanos that were in segregated conditions should basically feel happy because their wages were going up, they were getting benefits, and yeah, they weren't able to get into the skilled parts of the plant, but so, shit happens, right? And that was one view. Now, there was another view, and it was most especially represented by the Packinghouse Workers, which was led by the left. And one of the things about the Packinghouse Workers was that they fought segregation in the plants, and they fought segregation in the hiring, which many unions didn't. They fought discriminatory hiring. So there were these two very different views about what it meant to be inclusive. But the other part about being inclusive is this. Inclusive is not diversity. I'll tell you what diversity is. Diversity is when I invite you over to dinner. I don't ask you what you want. I tell you what time you're supposed to be at my house. I set the table, right? I tell you where you're going to sit, and we eat. That's diversity. Now, inclusion is where I ask you, are there foods that you don't eat? Are you allergic to anything? What time works in terms of coming over here? Are you bringing a partner, right? Where there's that kind of discussion. Too many of our organizations have diversity, right? Where there is no collective leadership. And this was true in much of the union movement, and has been true. Where basically we're told, no, come on in, right? And you come in, but you have to follow the rules that are established by someone else. Black radicalism challenges that. It says, no, homie, don't play that, right? Inclusion means that I get to negotiate my role, right? I get to negotiate and to be treated with respect, not to be treated like a chump. I'm not your boy or your girl. And so we have to think in all spheres, not just the trade union movement, that we have to go beyond diversity, and we actually have to go deeper than inclusion. And we have to really talk about equity. The final point, I mentioned about after World War II and what happened in the labor movement, and it's critical that we appreciate, and I think it's very relevant today, the importance of red baiting. Now, in 2016, when Senator Sanders did not get the nomination, I found myself in an argument with a number of people who kept saying the same thing. They said, Bill, if Sanders had gotten the nomination, he would have kicked Trump's. And I said, maybe, but there's something you're not talking about, which is that if he got the nomination, there would be red baiting and Jew baiting, the likes of which we have not seen in a long time. Are you ready for that? I mean, are you like ready? You ready to speak up? And we see it now. And you see what happens when this red baiting starts and when people start getting nervous, people that you might have had confidence in, who all of a sudden start getting very shaky and start worrying about who they're associated with. And in the 1940s, it came as a surprise to many people because of the breadth of the New Deal coalition that the red baiting that could unfold could have been as serious and as damaging. If any of you saw the film Trumbo, which I thought was amazing, it's really interesting about Dalton Trumbo, the screenwriter. It's amazing in the very beginning when the red baiting is starting. It's interesting because he's not taking it very seriously. He's just saying, and then it starts creeping in. And red baiting became a very successful means of thwarting Black radicalism, both in the trade union movement as well as externally. It also became a very useful means of breaking unity among workers. One of the things, and this is not a joke, one of the things that the FBI used to do when they would go to visit white leftists or people that they thought were leftists was to find out whether they had any Black friends. And to have Black friends, therefore, meant you had to be a communist. And they would go interviewing people's neighbors to find out, does such and such have Black friends? And if they did, they'd end up on a list. And this worked its way in the trade union movement and had a devastating impact, not just on the trade union movement as a whole, but on Black worker activists in particular, driving many out of the country. You mentioned Claudia Jones. I'd also add Ferdinand Smith, who was one of the two top-ranking Black people in organized labor. He was the Secretary-Treasurer of the National Maritime Union. Ewan Gamir was the Secretary-Treasurer of the United Public Workers. They were the two top people. Ferdinand Smith, who was an immigrant, driven out of the country. This red baiting had this impact. And the red baiting was very successful in many, many ways, including within Black America, in intimidating people. And my final point about that is that it had an impact on what came to be understood as Black radicalism. Because in the very immediate period after World War II, people like Du Bois and Robeson had a global conception of Black radicalism. And they were, through the Council on African Affairs, talking about not only the liberation of Africa, but of the Indian subcontinent. And they saw the liberation of the Indian subcontinent as important as the liberation of Africa. But with the introduction of anti-communism and red baiting, what's really interesting is that the parameters for Black discourse were narrowed. We could no longer talk about international affairs unless we were talking only about Africa, and even then we had to be very careful. We could not speak about India. We could not speak about Indonesia, right? We could only speak about what we were allowed to speak on. And even there, the analysis was limited. So the idea of a class analysis of Africa and the national liberation movements, which people like Du Bois and Robeson were articulating, no. That became a no-no. We could only look at Africa through a racial prism, which meant, on the one hand, we were ready to endorse and support anti-colonial struggles. On the other hand, it made us completely unprepared for the Rwanda genocide, because there were no white people. There were no white people in Kigali. And that was a legacy of red baiting and of anti-communism. And it was profound, and we live with it today. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up for some discussion. I don't know how much time we have. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
What should have been a response to Bernie Sanders trying to silence him on his comments about Cuba?
You mean if I was Sanders' advisor, what would I have told him to do?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'll take that.
All right, good. I don't want to push it too hard, you know what I mean? But I think that part of what he said was good. I think that that I would have said that how dare you get in my face about this when you have been silent about so many activities of the United States internationally? How dare you be in my face about Cuba when you're willing to support the president of Singapore? How dare you get in my face about Cuba when we have illiteracy in the United States? And we have people like dying from lack of medical care. How dare you? That's what I would have said. Right? And see, the thing is that Sanders doesn't have to endorse the Cuban administration. It's not about that. It's like you can look at different social experiments. I'll give you an example. You can look at Norway and say, Norway has done a really great job, right? And just in so many ways. But Norway has been able to do this because of oil. Now, that means that Norway is contributing to global warming. Now, do we basically just say, well, the hell with Norway because of that? No, it's something that you factor in. You can say, these are some contributions, and these are things that I disagree with. So obviously, they were just trying to set them up. And I think that we have to be diplomatically very offensive every so often in going after people. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's important, Bill, to talk about the suppression of figures like W. Du Bois and his contribution to the Black liberation movement and the understanding that it brought of Paul Robeson, of people like William L. Patterson, who led the International Legal Defense, who defended these Scots World Wars, and their relationship within the council, the council, as you mentioned. If you can expand a little bit, why is it that people today don't know as much about Du Bois and Paul Robeson and William Patterson? What's the purpose of keeping people quiet about, or keeping them blind about these figures and their contributions?
You know, Du Bois and Robeson, among others, were abandoned by many of us in Black America. And people don't want to say that because, you know, they're postage stamps, right? So everything is cool, right? But Robeson basically died alone and not in good health, physically, mentally. Felt very isolated, was abandoned, was one of the most brilliant people in the 20th century and was just abandoned. Du Bois was driven out of the United States, constantly harassed. But it's important to understand that they were abandoned in part because of the level of fear that existed within Black America. When Du Bois was attacked in the 1930s, there was a major response in Harlem. And I didn't realize this. My great-grandfather, a man named William Stanley Braithwaite, who was a very close friend of Du Bois, was one of the major people in organizing this response. And it was beating back the attack on Du Bois. But by the late 40s, the left was weaker, and the red baiting fear was permeating things. I mean, just to give you an example in terms of fear, when I was growing up, I became politically conscious at a very, very young age. And I had an uncle who was in the CP. And he was an amazing guy. And he gave me a Pete Seeger album. And the album disappeared. Now, there's a couple of possibilities. One is that a jinn took it. I don't know whether there's any Muslims in the audience. Jinns are spirits that inhabit this world with us and can be very mischievous, right? So one argument is that a jinn came into my house and took the album. Now, another explanation is that my father got rid of the album. And I tend to think, as much as I'd like to believe it was jinn, because they seem to mess with me periodically, I think it was my father. I think that he was scared to have the Pete Seeger album in the house. And, you know what I mean? And you know, it's like, that's why I say, when people were talking about, in 2016, about Bernie, it's like, yeah, I wanted Bernie to win too, but we got to understand, taking on anti-communism, you're taking on some serious fear, because this country has a long history. It's not just about what happened in the 40s and 50s. It's like the anti-syndicalism acts that were passed as a way of destroying unions. It was the concentration camps that were set up in 1934 for the families of strikers in the great textile strike of that year, right? I mean, this has a long history of repression. So what happened with Du Bois and Robeson is that they were ultimately abandoned. And Du Bois was able to die in dignity. The other thing that happens is that, I remember, I think it was in the beginning of the State Revolution, that Lenin talks about the way that the oppressor takes our heroes and transforms them into useful objects, right? And that has happened with every one of them, whether it's Robeson, Du Bois, Malcolm, you name it, right? That our oppressor takes them and does surgery and removes certain pieces of them to make them safe objects for us to worship. So you can look at a Du Bois and you can say, what a great scholar. You can look at a Robeson and say, oh, what an incredible genius. But when you look at Robeson, you don't necessarily think about the Spanish Civil War, right? You don't necessarily think about him going to strikes. You don't think about him speaking out against the Cold War, right? So he becomes safer. I'm sorry? Peekskill, right. He becomes safer. And so it goes back to what I said in the very beginning about Black History Month, that we, the oppressed, we're in a constant battle to redefine and articulate our history. It's never won. It's never won until we have defeated and annihilated our opponents peacefully. Just because I know this is being quoted somewhere, and it's going to end up on Fox News, right? You know, right? So, this guy, right? But of course, I'm a very peaceful person. But until that happens, the reality is that when we win, it's no permanent win. And when it comes to history, the other side is constantly trying to rewrite it in a way to make it safer. Yes?
Yes. I fully appreciate your analysis and reference, and I agree with reference to Du Bois and Robeson, men and women who have studied like most folks here, in reference to the struggle. African Americans, the word black to describe a group that was labeled such for purposes of oppression and segregation. However, there's a powerful name, in my opinion, and others as well, though that hasn't been mentioned in the analysis. And I'd like to ask a loaded question with reference to this person, the Honorable Marcus Garvey. Kindly explain to the audience some of the strengths and contributions that man and the University Negro Improvement Association made to the struggles of Africans on a global level, and the concept, using the word black, in terms of racism and segregation.
You're not necessarily going to like what I have to say.
Oh, please, express yourself.
Garvey was a very complicated figure. And so I would start by the importance of Garvey includes the brilliance in leading a mass movement on a scale that has not been replicated in the United States. His assertion of Black pride, his assertion of the importance of some level of Pan-African consciousness, but Garvey also engaged in a certain level of magical thinking about the resolution of our oppression. He made the same mistake that Elijah Muhammad made in believing that there could be peace in our time with the Klan. And that the white supremacists were so anxious to get rid of us that they would accept his argument for the relocation of African people. And I think he missed the point. White supremacists the more active, the Nazis, they may want us out. But US capitalism does not want us out. US capitalism needs us because we are the other. Our existence here is central to the continuation of capitalism. And our existence as an other that can constantly be pointed to as, for whites, you don't want to be in there. Look at what is happening to them. They are the ones that are the threat. I don't think Garvey got that. The other thing is that Garvey made a major mistake in understanding his relationship to the continent of Africa. That he never visited Africa. I'm not faulting him for that. But I am saying that Africa itself is very complex. And to think that he would assert himself to essentially be the leader of African people, that's problematic. And there's some other aspects as well that one could go into. So I would say that, and I guess see, when I look at the period when Garvey was taking off in the United States, I'm more on the African Blood Brotherhood, Hubert Harrison side of things. And basically the idea of the social movement that needed to be built, and the anti-capitalist movement, the movement for self-determination, that was being asserted by people like Harrison, Cyril Briggs, Richard Moore, and other folks that emerged at that time. And I think that one of the mistakes, though, that people like Briggs and Du Bois made was they allowed themselves, particularly Du Bois, allowed himself to be played against Garvey. And that was a major judgment error for Du Bois's part, who made other such errors, like in World War I, supporting World War I. And so so that's what I'm saying. It's complex to me, and I can appreciate his significance while at the same time not look at him in the same way that I would look at Du Bois or even Padmore. Yes.
Yes, but so far, everything you say, I agree with you.
Thank you.
Regard to Sanders, it reminded me of when we about Malcolm. When you ask the question, you go like this. You look at the question, you ask me any question, anything in regard to anybody. And as my understanding, Malcolm got his speaking style of the great groups.
That's right.
And Malcolm had this way of saying, uncompromised in a way, like Martin, like Baba and groups in me. So Malcolm is pretty right. Sanders should have said, you in no position to me, or why do I hide you there? When I decrease you when you ever leave. You know? So you're in no position to tell me about that. When you're committed murder all over the world. And as Malcolm mentioned in terms of the Prohibition Act, when Malcolm said he was fought to this, was fought. I mean, as Malcolm said, they could take it. That's why they killed him. Because I think Sanders means well, but quite frankly, for me, I don't think he's grounded.
Well, see, I would disagree on a little bit. So first of all, just to make a plug, there's a really good thing on Netflix about the murder of Malcolm that I recommend. And then there's Matty Marable's book, which I think was fabulous, Malcolm X's Life of Reinvention. So I want to recommend those. But in terms of, I think Sanders was grounded, and I'm not going to really kick him in his rear about that. I kick him in his rear about some other things, but not that. But I think that one of the things that pointed out, we have to remember, all of us have to remember, that the United States opposes history and embraces myth. Right? We actively oppose history. The United States goes out of its way to oppose history and to embrace myth. And therefore, this whole exchange that took place around Cuba is one of those things that is happening in the absence of historical analysis. Now, Sanders may not have been able to deliver the whole analysis, but part of our job is to do that. People have to understand history. You have to understand history if you're going to deal with race. Race is not about, as Rodney King said, how do we all get along? It ain't about that. It's about power, right? Who has it, who doesn't, and how it's being exercised. And when we're talking about the issue of Cuba or anything else, I'll give you an example. After 9/11, I got in a lot of trouble because I obviously opposed the terrorist attack, obviously. But I pointed out to many audiences that in 1965, over the course of 1 year, approximately somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million Indonesians were killed as a result of a coup organized by the CIA and MI6, right? Along with Suharto and his crew. And so I just decided one day to pull out a calculator and divide that by days. And the number of people killed per day. So that when we were being told that 9/11 was the worst terrorist incident that had ever happened, it was actually, no, that's not true on a whole lot of levels. And it doesn't make 9/11 any less important, but it does make it important for us in the United States the massacre of thousands of people a day in